So in reviewing what it was done in the prehistory of surveys, what was missing was methods of sampling and standardized questionnaires. Those are hallmarks of modern survey research. Let's take a look at how they developed in this prehistory of the modern survey. The first is that in the early days, Booth and his successors often attempted to reach conclusions about poverty, for example, by assessing a variety of characteristics and then forming some holistic single measure. These often relied on the judgment of the interviewer to reach a conclusion rather than a single direct assessment, let alone an assessment necessarily provided by the what we would now call the respondent to the survey. Even later, interview work often relied on the interviewer to reach similar conclusions. Some were fairly simple observations, so for example from some of the American social survey work, was the house stone, brick, wood, or a shack? Frankly, I'm not quite sure the difference between wood and shack, but I assume the interviewers did. Others required getting more information. What kinds of games were played in the house? Card games, caroms, checkers, dominoes, number toys? What about pets, cats, dogs, rabbits, others? This information was collected, but it was not constructed by direct, standardized questions posed to a respondent. Instead, the interviewer used their judgment and understanding and observation. Sometimes this was amusing. In one survey, the interviewer assessed the clothing that was worn by the respondent and whether it was spotted, dusty, torn, worn, patched, mussed, or wrinkled. But this tradition of using interviewers to provide their own judgments persists in some cases even to today, where modern surveys sometimes, including the National Election Study, the preeminent election study by academics, ask the interviewer to rate how cooperative was the respondent, how interested about politics were they, did the interviewer think the respondent accurately reported income, and if not, calls on the interviewer to give an estimate of the income. A few more interesting ones: how intelligent did the respondent seem? And my favorite, how attractive is the respondent, on a scale ranging from striking to homely. This practice of indirect measurement continued into the 1930s to be commonly used. And one of the major changes in survey practice was the evolution from these informal assessments of measurement to more rigidly structured measurements. For that, we're going to turn to a slightly different element of this history of the survey, developments in psychological scaling, primarily in the 1920s and 30s. Interestingly, attitudes and their measurement were largely scorned by academic psychology in the 1920s, going so far as an official resolution of condemnation by a professional association of experimental psychologists. Early efforts in this line addressed the question of the concept of attitude. Now, you may be surprised, but attitude turns out to be surprisingly hard to define. The early development of it was due to W.I. Thomas, who in the 1920s wrote a book called The Polish Peasant. Let's try that again. The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, in which the notion of attitude was presented as a state of consciousness, a potential activity toward or away some object. By 1935, Gordon Allport could count no less than 16 different definitions of the word attitude. In some ways, they're more easily defined by what they're not. Not instincts or traits of personality, things that are permanent. Not inherent or biological in origin. But maybe more surprisingly to modern people, not just ideas, beliefs, or ideologies, things of a mere intellectual matter. But one view of attitudes of this period was that they also overlaid emotion and desire, things which in modern studies are sometimes conflated with attitudes, but often taken as not part of attitudes. And finally, the work of Alpert stressed that these were not mere opinions. Attitudes should touch some deep structure of psychology. So those were the theoretical questions that psychologists were asking about defining attitudes. We're more interested in the measurement.